Welcome, everyone. My name is Kritika Rajkumar, and I am the Head of Legal and Compliance at CAREspaces. On behalf of CAREspaces and SNS Arts Development Consultancy, I would like to welcome you all to Session 1 of our ImAProfessionalToo series. This session and all the upcoming sessions in our series are free and welcome to every stakeholder in the Indian art space: artists, supporting professionals, connoisseurs, organizers, parents, teachers, and hosts. The core question that we want to answer in these sessions is, when you hear the words, "I'm a professional too," or say those words, what does that mean for you and the person you are interacting with? How can we hold each other accountable? Before we introduce our panelists, I wanted to take a minute to put this series into context with our organization, CAREspaces. We are a referral service nonprofit organization aimed at creating resources and actionable solutions to address any workplace misconduct in the context of the Indian arts. CAREspaces takes the energy from the Me Too movement. Now, what does that mean? That means that we acknowledge the Me Too movement and all that it uncovered about our community, but we are asking deeper questions to understand the why. As a community, we often don't understand enough about the nuanced system that enabled this movement: the environment or the setting, the misalignment of expectations, the types of tendencies we have as a community. CAREspaces seeks to give our community all the options it needs for recovery and repair from an incident like that: tools for learning, healing, and accountability. With SNS, we are proud to share the common goal of bringing more accountability to our spaces with the launch of this series. SNS Arts Development Consultancy provides strategic guidance, artist management, fundraising, sponsorship, operational, and revenue management strategies for artists and arts companies around the world. Each session in this series gives every stakeholder in this space the knowledge and negotiation skills to apply that knowledge with their everyday interactions in the Indian art space. Now, to get into the title of our series a bit more: words associated with being professional. We often hear the word professionalism, and it's a very broad term. Too broad in a way because it doesn't account for the variety and gray areas we have in our spaces, which you will hear more about in our discussion today. So within the aspects of professionalism, paid work, qualification or formal education, and standards, we want to focus on conduct specifically. The conduct that is appropriate in certain settings and the types of conduct we expect from ourselves and in the interaction between one another. Our future sessions will address other aspects of the conduct within the nature of work in the Indian arts, such as creative IP, finances, and boundary setting. So stay tuned for each of those sessions, which will be happening on a monthly basis. Today, we are not here to discuss how to make a career out of these art forms or how to make it your profession, but rather we are here to describe the ethical professional conduct that can be the default of arts practices in the various spaces we operate in, regardless of what stage of your career you are in. In each of our sessions, we are discussing how professional conduct applies to the topic of the session. In our first session today, we will be discussing the role of professional conduct in the context of workspaces. To understand workspaces, we need to define and redefine them. This is the first conversation of this kind, so you will see these basic concepts being discussed and evolving throughout the session. So here is Defining and Redefining Indian Arts Workspaces, the first session of our series. I would like to introduce our moderators for this session. First, we have Priyanka Dinakar. Priyanka received her degrees in political economy and women's and gender studies. As the CAREspaces legal researcher, she looks to bridge the gaps between interdisciplinary subjects and continue to educate herself on intersectional issues. She currently works in management consulting with a focus on data analytics. Our next moderator is Janani Ramesh. Janani is the co-founder and creative head of CAREspaces. As an aspiring medical educator, she hopes to bring her teaching and learning experiences from the arts to enhance medical education to foster knowledge-empowered communities that can learn and heal together. To create this type of community in the Indian art space, Janani merges her passion for learning-driven community healing through the creative direction, leadership, and mission of CAREspaces. I'm going to hand it over to both of them to carry this conversation forward. I'm going to be helping out on the back end with any legal and compliance questions on the YouTube comments. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Once again, thank you all for joining us and enjoy the session.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sutikshna Veeravalli, and I'm the Education and Peer Team Lead for CAREspaces along with Sachin. Today, I will be collecting your questions for the Q&A session at the end of today's session. I have the pleasure of introducing Shreya. Shreya Nagarajan Singh is an arts development consultant based out of Chennai, India. She is a trained Bharatanatyam dancer with a background in arts management. Shreya was selected for the prestigious Asia Pacific Leadership Program at the East-West Center, Hawaii, and has traveled extensively around Southeast Asia doing research on dance and dance practice. Shreya has also worked extensively as an arts development consultant to build brand and audience through outreach events in Chennai for various clients. Shreya completed her master's on a Fulbright scholarship as arts management at Columbia College, Chicago's Department of Business and Entrepreneurship. In 2017, Shreya launched SNS Arts Development Consultancy, which provides strategic guidance, artists management, fundraising, sponsorship, and operational and revenue management strategies for artists and art companies. Please join me in welcoming Shreya Nagarajan Singh.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Neha Krishnamachari. I am the co-founder and head of finance for CAREspaces. Today, I'm going to be helping out with tech on the back end, and I'll be helping field some audience questions and passing it over to our panelists. I'm really excited to welcome another member of CAREspaces and a panelist for today, Guhan Venkatraman. Guhan Venkatraman learned Carnatic Veena for 10 years under Kalemamini Srimati Ranganayaki Rajagopalan and continues his scholarship under Vidwans Sri R.K. Sriram Kumar and Sri Delhi P. Sundarajan. As a person who has been involved with Carnatic music for a number of years in multiple roles, he was inspired by the opportunities for structural change that could benefit all parties in the Indian art space. He holds a bachelor's degree from Stanford in bioengineering and continues higher studies as a PhD candidate in biomedical informatics. Welcome, Guhan.
Thank you.
Both Shreya and Guhan are here to represent the SNS and CAREspaces perspectives, respectively. So you will see them interacting a little bit differently from the other panelists. They'll be asking some questions based on their perspectives. So we just wanted to thank them for doing that for us today. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Radhipriya Suresh, Head of Design and Lead UX UI Designer at CAREspaces. I, along with Sutikshna from our team, will be gathering your questions for the Q&A portion at the end of today's session. I'm honored to introduce Aditya Prakash to today's conversation. An award-winning vocalist known for his powerful and emotive voice, Aditya is a young virtuoso of Carnatic music and one of the youngest musicians to tour and perform with Ravi Shankar at the age of 16. He has worked with leading innovators of the arts, such as Anushka Shankar, Karsh Kale, Tigran Hamassian, and Akram Khan. As a soloist, Aditya has performed to acclaim at the leading institutions of Carnatic music in India. In 2010, he founded the Aditya Prakash Ensemble, a group that frames Aditya's highly ornamented, stylized, and emotive vocal style around jazz instrumentation, a collaboration that is modern and accessible. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome panelist Aditya Prakash.
Yep. Hi, everyone. My name is Sachin Pense, and I am the peer team lead, along with Sutikshna. Today, I'll be helping write notes on this session. I have the honor today of introducing Rashmi Singh. Rashmi is a gender specialist with 20 years of working in different organizations advocating for marginalized communities. She's currently the executive director of the International Foundation for Crime Prevention and Victim Care in Chennai. Thank you for sharing your time with us. We'd like to welcome Rashmi Singh.
Hello, my name is Colin Herzog, a business strategy consultant with SNS, and I'll be helping monitoring the YouTube chat. And it is my pleasure to introduce panelist Samita Shivatsa. She is a dance writer and social science educator, currently based out of Bhopal. She has written columns on the historical and political landscape of dance in India for the First Post and for The Pulse. She has also written several reviews of performances for the Friday Review section of the Hindu newspaper. She is keen on building a body of work that can bridge the gap between academic scholarship and the field of dance. For this, she is interested in engaging with dance through the medium of both text and body. Currently, she's preoccupied with questions around what it means to build a practice of resistance within classical dance. What should activism and work of social justice look like in the Indian dance context, both in performance and pedagogy? How can aesthetic and embodied practices of marginalized traditions foreground alternative ways of understanding the body? Join me in welcoming Samita.
Hello, my name is Aishwarya Chandrasekhar. I'm the graphic designer and illustrator at CAREspaces. Today I'll be working on the tech backend for the session. I have the pleasure of announcing Shiv Nadkarni. Shiv is a highly trained creative and medical student holding his bachelor's degree in Kathak from Samved Conservatory of Music and Dance. He is trained in Kathak under the able tutelage of his guru, Srimati Archana Joplekar, for over 15 years and was honored with the title of Nava Gandharva in Kathak by Madhyam in 2016. Most recently, Shiv used his Fulbright Award to earn an MA in Anthropology of Dance at the University of Roehampton in London, where he won the Best Dissertation Award for his thesis exploring inherent gender fluidity in Kathak. With interdisciplinary passions in dance, music, liberation, medicine, and LGBTQ health, Shiv plans to continue performing and studying the ever-changing form that is Kathak as he continues his scholarship in both dance and medicine, hoping to be an advocate for non-traditional and creative careers. Please join me in welcoming Shiv.
Shiv is having a little bit of some tech issues, so he will join in just a few minutes.
Yes. I'm Vikram. Medium is another. Guru Padma Bhushan Tamak Shah has presented her work around the world and at home to particular claim, including city centers Europe, the IAPT Theatre in Europe, the Kennedy Center, Washington DC, Asian Society, New York, Jacob Fellow Inside Out series, and many work in New York. The Japan Foundation to welcoming Arun Shah to this discussion.
I'm not sure if it was breaking up for everyone. I think we're having a little bit of a tech situation. Neha, would you like to introduce Parul?
Yeah, I can do that. So just one more time for those who weren't able to hear it because of our tech issue. Parul Shah is an artistic director of the Parul Shah Dance Company and is an internationally acclaimed Kathak and contemporary dancer and choreographer whose work is expanding the classical medium beyond cultural boundaries. With a dedication to excellence, Shah preserves the form's aesthetic integrity while exploring contemporary stories and questions around belonging, identity, and empathy. Her work aims to create shared experiences and lasting connections between performers and audience members. Behind Parul's work is decades of rigorous Kathak training under the world-renowned guru and choreographer Padma Bhushan Gurumani Lakia. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce that correctly. I'm reading this for the first time. Parul's repertoire spans both classical and contemporary dance vocabularies, and her influences include her own experiences and observations just as much as her training. Building on the dance form's mythological storytelling roots, Shah explores narratives using a movement vocabulary that draws from her classical training, but extends to her personal history and culture to communicate the dynamic and often paradoxical nature of modern life through compelling solo and group choreographies. She's especially driven to shining a light on marginalized stories and is committed to outreach and education. Parul's New York studio is home to both the Parul Shah Dance Company and her training facility. With their master's degree in dance and dance education from Columbia University Teachers College, Parul has been teaching Kathak for over 15 years. Shah presented her work around the world and at home to critical acclaim, including City Center's Fall for Dance Festival in New York, the New Victory Theater in New York City, and the Kennedy Center of Washington, D.C., Asia Society of New York City, and Jacob Pillow Inside Out series in Massachusetts. Please welcome Parul Shah.
With this, I believe we've introduced all of our panelists. Thank you for everyone who made those introductions, and thank you to all of the speakers for being here today. Thank you to everyone who is joining us on the YouTube Live. Apologies for a few tech issues on that side, which I'm hearing about. So please just hold tight for us for a second. And thank you to all of our members who are helping us back end. We really, really appreciate your time and effort. So with that, Priyanka and I would like to start this session. Priyanka, would you like to start with an introduction?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's joining us from all over the world. Thank you again for tuning in for this very important session. We find that in the Indian art space, we have many overlapping intersectional issues in a very complex and drastically different spaces of operation. We are here to discuss the system that is the Indian arts community and break it down into its components: the who, the what, the where, specifically the type of conduct in various settings of our Indian art space. This session is really meant to unpack the conduct we should uphold in our spaces. What are those spaces? Who do we share these spaces with? And what do we do in these spaces? These are the fundamental questions we are here to answer today. You might hear the Me Too movement referenced, but we will be asking questions that will help us get to the where, who, the why, and the how regarding the settings in which these issues took place in. This is why our session is about the setting in which we call our workspaces.
We'd like to take a minute to acknowledge the hereditary artists throughout India and recognize the importance of their contributions to this art form represented on this panel today. We pay our respects to their community, past, present, and emerging. This discussion features voices from the art forms of Carnatic music, Kathak, and Bharatanatyam, and we understand the privilege that comes with access and proximity to these art forms. Although we may come from different ecosystems, this is a safe space. So we are all approaching this conversation with mutual respect, empathy, and active listening, and we believe everyone and anyone in this space is equal regardless of age, gender, or experience. We request both speakers and listeners to do the same. Today, we will be discussing professional conduct in the context of Indian arts workspaces. It is not a topic that we as a community have had practice articulating much in the past. We've had a lot of conversations with all of the panelists, so thank you all for giving so much of your time to help us discover this topic a little bit more. We will be discovering and learning as we go in this conversation as well, and we will honor the honesty and vulnerability that comes with learning and discovery. So we ask the audience that you help us evolve in this learning journey with us. The conversation may start in one place and evolve to another place towards the end of the conversation. So just hang tight with us and definitely ask your questions in the live chat in the YouTube live stream. Thank you. And with that, I think we should start with a little bit of goals that we have for the session before we begin talking. And we want to make sure that everyone is aligned on that and that we can always speak to those goals whenever we're contributing our thoughts here.
Yeah, so as Janani mentioned, for the purposes of this conversation, we really want to focus on the words professional conduct to highlight a specific part of professionalism altogether. We want to focus mostly on the behavior or conduct that enables professional standards and healthy dynamics. So this conversation will be solution-minded to identify weaknesses in the practices in our community and identify ways to improve upon them. So some of the specific goals we have in mind for this session are to, one, provide relatable examples to be able to understand informal versus formal spaces and bringing awareness to the various workspaces that we occupy. To also understand the conduct within spaces and what defines a professional workspace and that space, just because a space is professional, it doesn't always imply that professional conduct or ethical conduct takes place in these workspaces. We also want to identify specific positives and negatives of various Indian arts workspaces. And then finally, to identify some best practices to encourage professional workspace conduct. So Janani will now get into the structure that our conversation will take today.
So we have split this conversation into 3 parts. The first part is going to be kind of just introducing and warming up to the words that we tend to throw around often, like formal, informal, extended workspaces. What is a workspace? What do we mean by conduct in terms of like based on examples that we hear and see, and also like actual definitions that our lawyer on board here, Rashmi, will be providing. So how we've decided to do this, just to give you guys kind of a different way of speaking about this, is to do this through a rapid fire round. So we'll start with that. And then the second section of our conversation will be focusing on experiences of each of the panelists and having them really speak from the various perspectives that we have present today. And then the third segment is going to be more actionable takeaways and solution-based. So obviously all of the panelists can contribute to that, but you'll hear the second section be more sectioned off so that we can actually focus on each person's experiences. So with that, we will start with a rapid fire round so we can hear the voices of all of our panelists here. And you can even do this at your homes as listeners as well in the audience. When we introduced this topic to the public, we got a lot of questions on what words we use interchangeably and what their definitions are. So first, I'd like to start with sort of our definition of conduct. And I like to say this a lot because I think it makes a lot of sense to me, which is how you conduct yourself or how you carry yourself and how you treat others. So we know that in these spaces, we are operating ourselves, we're doing something ourselves, but we're also interacting with other people, especially in the arts. We are interacting and collaborating with a lot of people to create art. So always think about how we're carrying ourselves and what that means for the other person. So that's how we are defining conduct. Now, we want to go in and define ethical professional conduct. And then after that, we'll start with our rapid fire round. So Priyanka, would you like to provide that definition? Or do you want to do that in more of a rapid fire situation?
Yeah, I think it would be good to bring in the panelists here and see what words come to mind to all of them when we talk about ethical professional conduct and what that looks like.
And just note that this is all just extemporaneous. So people might have similar answers and repetitive answers. That's totally fine. So when we call on you as a panelist, just any words that come to mind when you think of ethical professional conduct, just say those words.
Yeah, and if we could start with Guhan, actually, would you be able to share some of the words that come to mind when you think of the phrase ethical professional conduct?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say communication and, preferably written communication, something that enables any participant to look back on what was said or done and have a written record of it. That goes a long way to ensuring ethical professional conduct.
Yeah, definitely. And Shiv, what about you? What are some words that come to mind? Are they similar to what Gohan said, or are there other words that come to mind for you?
Feel free to just list them out too. Yeah, go ahead.
Along the same line, I would say like level of maturity and compensation comes to mind when you talk about professional ethical conduct.
What about Shreya, in your experience, what are some words that come to mind from that arts management perspective?
Equality, respect, freedom.
Yeah. Aditya, how about you?
Hi, I'd say respecting one another's time.
Perfect.
Yeah, definitely.
Padul, what about you?
Words that come to my mind are discipline, accountability, and respect.
Samita?
If we're thinking of Indian art spaces, then I would say inclusivity, safety, and perhaps even freedom to dissent and disagree.
Thank you. And Rashmi, do you have any general thoughts on ethical professional conduct, some words that come to your mind?
I think for me, one of the non-negotiable is, as Shreya said, respect, then a culture of zero tolerance, and a culture of speaking up. Because when we see cases of sexual harassment, especially in the Indian context, in any workplace, the culture of speaking up is something which is very important.
Thank you. So now, before we get into the spaces and workspaces, what is that? We got some questions as to what is workspace and what is workplace. So now we want to put these words into the space where we are doing these things, right? So Priyanka, can you kind of elaborate on a little bit about what we think workspace and workplace are? And these are not like dictionary definitions, right? This is just something that we're evolving as we go.
Yeah, definitely. And from our perspective, when we look specifically at the term workplace as opposed to workspace, so a workplace may be a physical location where someone may perform their work. So some examples of a workplace might be an office space, a school, or a factory. So what you would traditionally think of as where you would go to perform your work, like in a very formal setting. Whereas a workspace can be a bit more broad than that. It may not necessarily refer to a specific building, but could rather be a stage, a person's desk, where I'm sitting right now, that's a workspace, or other neutral locations where work may happen. So the reason that we're calling this session Redefining Workspaces is that the Indian arts is such a diverse space. There are so many different spaces that we work in, that we collaborate in, that we may not even consider a workspace just from first glance. So that's why we want to be able to break down what it means to actually operate in a workspace, and why there may be many more fluid examples of workspaces than may initially meet the eye. So Janani, would you be able to talk a little bit more about the components of a workspace? When you break down that compound word, what are some of the different considerations that people should take into account?
I mean, this has been my favorite way to unpack this session, is thinking about work and space as two separate words and really breaking that apart. So when I think about work in the Indian arts, I think about several components that are part of that. So one is the art form that you actually practice. What do you actually do? Do you have a degree or not, right? That could be the education component in your training. It could also be that you have a non-degree seeking sort of training that's more informal, or like in a guru sishya parampara sort of relationship. And then what are your roles? Like, are you a teacher? Are you an organizer? Are you a student? Are you an artist? What are you, right, in this space? You could be multiple things too. We see that all the time. And then in terms of time involvement, are you part-time, full-time? Do you pursue this as a hobby, like a serious hobby or a casual hobby, right? We see all this diversity in our Indian arts. And then we also see payment as a big part of this, which is coming up in a future session as well. Is this your primary source of income, your secondary source of income, or is it not your source of income, but sometimes you want to be paid, sometimes you don't want to be paid, right? And then, or are you a volunteer, right? That's also a possibility. And then definitely more ambiguous aspects of this, or things that are more personal to everyone, is experience and quality. So this is very difficult to determine as an artist or in the art space, right? Because it's so personal. It's like every artist has such a unique value add. So when we think about experiences, we can think amount of experience. We can think about, are you an amateur artist? Are you upcoming? Are you just learning? Are you seasoned, or are you a veteran artist? And then what kind of quality do you bring? Are you beginner, intermediate, advanced, or an expert? And obviously these are like very broad categories, and there's a lot of gray areas and overlaps between these, right? So these are just some categories that I was thinking about when I was preparing for this session, and I just wanted to share that with you all. So those are all things that are pertaining to work, right? But then when we think about spaces, I think we can think about how defined they are. Are they undefined or defined, or have we really acknowledged them at all? Sometimes we haven't acknowledged it, we haven't really thought about it. And how formal are they? Are they informal, semi-formal, or very formal, or are they a social setting? So right now, I want to take a minute to ask the audience for some ask the panelists for some examples on Indian arts, formal, informal, and extended spaces that you've operated in. Again, this is going to be rapid fire sort of format.
Janani, if you don't,
go ahead.
I just want to jump in and say one thing. So when you talk about Indian arts context, it's also very broad because there's contemporary art, there's performing art, there's folk art, there's literature, there's so many different things. And I think for this conversation, we're specifically looking at performing arts and we're specifically looking at classical arts. I just want to make sure that we're all very clear that we're speaking about this specific niche. Go ahead.
Right. And that's a good point to add as well over here is some space that seems formal to me may not seem formal to someone else based on their experiences. And you'll hear us say that a lot. So you might even hear those differences when the panelists talk about their examples, right? So I may feel like my home was a really formal space of learning, but for someone else that it feels informal, right? Depending on their experience or depending on the conduct in that space. So there's no right or wrong answers. Again, we might have some overlaps in answers. Over here in this section, I'd like Guhan, Shiv, Shreya, Aditya, and Parul to comment on these examples and just whatever comes to mind, 1 or 2 words. And they also vary based on purpose of the space. So think about that as well. If you would like to mention the purpose, feel free. And then last, we'll actually have Rashmi come in with formal definitions from the law as to what a formal space is defined as, an informal space is defined as, an extended space is defined as in the law. And then I'll have a little chat with Samhita based on some exciting conversations we had before this. So if we can start with the rapid fire right now, again, Guhan, would you like to tell us a formal, informal, and extended space?
Sure. So when I think of a formal space, at least in the context of Indian arts, I think of, for example, where artists perform for formal spaces, so perhaps an auditorium. And then I think of informal spaces. And I think of, for example, where I took classes. I took classes in a teacher's home. I went there, and then, obviously there's a dedicated portion of the home that was dedicated to that learning of that art form, but it was still an informal space as compared to, for example, other industries. And then examples of extended spaces. So this might be in and around an auditorium. It might be in a sub-bar canteen where you're meeting up other people of that profession, for example. So there's so those are my examples of those 3 different spaces. But obviously there are many, many others.
Right. So now, Shiv, what comes to your mind when you think of a formal, informal, and extended space?
Yeah, I think Guhan covered it pretty well, but kind of the same. I think of like an auditorium, or for dance, I think of a formal studio space. And then informal, I would think of more like teacher's home or my guru's home, my guru's basement, where like you roll up the rug and then you like perform on, a piece of hardwood floor. I wasn't familiar with extended spaces actually, or like that term before you said that. But I would imagine it would be like something that sits outside of this or some kind of fluid middle ground. So I would imagine like a green room or somewhere that you are, collaborating with co-artists.
Thank you for that. Aditya, a formal, informal, and extended space for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of overlap. I agree with Shiv and Guhan that anywhere you perform is a formal space. It could be like an auditorium or even an art gallery. Even sometimes I've performed at like a music club, a bar, a jazz club. So those are also formal spaces. An informal space is, for me, was also my guru's home, bedroom at my guru's home, which was dedicated for music classes. In my context, an example of an extended space could be a restaurant, a bar, anywhere you're going, maybe post part of work, having work discussions with your collaborator at one of those spaces. So that is also an example.
Thank you. And Parul, any formal, informal, and extended spaces that come to mind?
Sure. Again, I think there's a clear overlap. When I think of a formal space, I think of educational institutions, proper kind of performance venues. Informal, I think of maybe like a Baitak style kind of performance happening in someone's home, learning in someone's home. And as far as extended spaces, I think of a few things. If we're talking about in a performance realm, I think of site-specific work that can be in a garden, a park, a stairwell, various various different options. And I also, for myself, I taught for many, many years in the basement of my parents' restaurant, which became my studio. Maybe, I don't know if we can talk about that, but that is definitely an extended space.
Thank you for that. Yes, and I actually thought of a few as well. For me, a formal space, it's also the performance spaces, but also studios, right? Photo and video shooting studios, audio editing studios, and recording studios. Informal spaces can be so many different things. We heard a lot of examples. An extended space that I really want to make sure we're mentioning so that we can mention it later too is online spaces, especially with COVID being a thing. We don't think about our online space as a performing artist that much. We're always interacting with people on YouTube, Facebook, all the socials, and also just like having this kind of a conversation is actually an extended space of our work. So with that, I would like Rashmi to come in with some law definitions, just one sentence each on formal, informal, and extended spaces.
Can I
Shreya, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. I just wanted to say it's very similar in terms of what everybody else has said, but I thought it was interesting that I have taken some Indian classes abroad, like in Hawaii and in Chicago when I was there too. And those spaces of teaching, right, where we feel it's very informal, were very formal for me, because I felt like people were punctual, they knew exactly how long the class was going to be. There was a clear not a contract, but there was an agreement of, you're going to teach me XYZ and I don't have time, and if you're more than 15 minutes late, we're going to have to cancel the class, etc. So that felt very formal to me, even though it was Indian classes abroad. So I think that's a very interesting contrast to look at formal and informal, because it's not just how you feel, but it's about how you conduct the space as well.
Exactly. And we're going to talk more about this. Thank you for that. So now, Rashmi, if you'd like to come in with some definitions for us.
Yeah. So I'm going to share more the definitions which actually come from the Prevention, Prohibition and Redressal of Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act of 2013. And we all know that this act came when Bhavri Devi's incident happened, which was a case of rape, and a first case which was reported as a case of sexual harassment. Now, in this act particularly defines workplace, which first it defines that, and which says anywhere where it defines it as an establishment, and says any kind of transactions which are happening between an employee and an employer. So that is a very technical definition. But then when the act goes to defining formal and informal spaces, so in the formal space, it gives examples of libraries, hospitals, hotels, schools, colleges, coaching institutions, like all of that. And then particularly when this act came in 2013, it specified the informal workspace and the informal sector. And when it says informal sector, then it is very clearly talking about where, especially the labor laws don't apply. So, from a very technical, the unorganized sector. So let's say domestic workers, or let's say, in your context of art, where, classes are happening in somebody's house. So all these come under, and let's suppose there's a teacher who's going to multiple places. So for that person, these become informal spaces. So that's one. The third is about the extended workspace, which all of you already said. So I will just give you an examples to make it more specific. The act says anywhere you are because of work. So anywhere. So you are traveling, you are in a hotel, it tries to take the definition of a workplace from a very physical premise or a building to anywhere you are because of work relationships or work. Yeah.
Rashmi, does that also... Sorry. Yeah. Go ahead, Priyanka.
Yeah. So thank you for those definitions, and to specifically about extended workspaces and what that means. I think that definitely covers some of the examples that the panelists shared of green rooms, traveling together. But I wonder specifically about when artists are touring together and maybe they're socializing afterwards, like after a performance. if they're not necessarily socializing because of work, but it's more so because it's a casual interaction, they're socializing because they're friends, separate from the fact that they are collaborators. Does that still hold up as an extended workspace?
I always, when this kind of an example come, I just love that example because this is very common. And we've dealt with cases where there is an office party, but it's not an official party, but then there's a party happening in a person's place, a birthday party or a New Year party, and that's not an official party. And there we had like a case where, there was a boss and then he was trying to just, being inappropriate behavior with another woman, but they were from the same office, but the party was not official. Mm. Now, when this case came to the committee for investigation, then of course, the respondent said, but then that wasn't an official party, as you rightly said, Priyanka. But then how we looked at it as a workplace harassment or an inappropriate behavior case, because the relationship they shared and the power dynamics which was there, it was arising out of the professional relationship they share. So they are very, very thin lines, because even if they were in a personal party, but then the person who's conducting that behavior is very much aware of the power that person holds, and they are arising of the professional relationship. So that comes under workplace, inappropriate behavior or harassment.
Thank you so much for saying that. That was actually the same question I had, Priyanka. So I'm glad you covered that. Yeah. But that actually goes right into kind of our point of like, what are these categories? We have to really question these categories in terms of what we thought they were, and then how we can modify that and redefine, right? So we defined a little bit by ourselves, had Rashmi come in with the law now, and now we have to sort of redefine and reorient ourselves. So I had some very interesting conversations with Samita, and I just want to talk about, how fluid do you think these categories are? These categories are just for us to get organized with our thoughts, but they're not that black and white, right? So Samita, can you comment a little bit on that, please?
It's very much along the lines of what everybody said. So I was just telling Janani yesterday that for me, it's really hard to think of spaces, even especially within the Indian classical arts, strictly within the categories of formal or informal, because I have occupied always I go to my teacher's house to learn dance, but the space that she has created is pretty impersonal and not intimate. It's very formal, but at the same time, there are performance spaces which are just so intimate, and you have the performer performing at such a close quarters to the audience, and so it is a very personal and an intimate space. Or for example, in fact, when I was training for Maya Arangetram, I didn't go to my teacher's home to learn, but because there was lack of space in her house, she came over to my place to teach every day. So it was my own home where I every day watched television and did all of these things, which was transformed into a pretty, I wouldn't say formal or informal, because yes, when she taught it was formal, but she stayed over for a chai after the dance class. So I was just having a conversation along similar lines and trying to tell her that that I'm unable to actually look at spaces and think of them very strictly as formal or informal.
Yeah, and it's so personal to everyone in terms of their experiences that they had. And we actually pride ourselves in the Indian arts to think about this collaborative space where we're sharing time and creativity with our friends. That's a big part of what we do. And by no means is this conversation trying to take that away from this community. So I hope audiences understand that. It's about how to work with that dynamic in a better way. So with that, I kind of want to go into thinking about the spaces with professional conduct and ethical professional conduct, and what you do in those spaces, and how do you still engage with friends, family, and acquaintances in your work, but in a healthy way, right? So Priyanka, if you want to kind of transition us into the experience-based portion of this conversation, that would be great.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you all for sharing your takeaways on these different vocabulary terms. It's very important that we situate ourselves by defining these terms and giving examples as well, because we want to make sure that everyone has a solid understanding, including us as CAREspaces. So next, the second segment is specifically, we've called it experience-based learning. So we'll call on each of the different panelists to be able to share more about their own experiences and narratives so that we can learn from that. So specifically to begin, we have 4 practitioners, Shiv, Parul, Aditya, and Samita, being able to offer their own perspectives and case studies specific to the experiences that they've had as arts practitioners. With Samita being able to bridge the gap between being a dancer but also being a writer. And then finally with Guhan and Shreya and Rashmi being able to provide additional expert context from the fields that they are in. So I want to start with Aditya here. Even for those who might be intimately familiar with the arts that you're in, all the different art that you've put out, could you first start by talking about the different roles that you occupy within the Indian arts, just to get the conversation started?
Yeah, sure. I am a performer. I am a collaborator, a guest artist for some people's projects. I am a producer. I'm a composer. I am also a friend, a brother to other artists that I'm working with, and brother to my sister who's a dancer. Yeah, I think those are the roles that come to mind. Yeah.
Yeah. I like that you also mentioned some of the personal relationships you have with people in the arts, because as Janani mentioned, and as we've found from talking to all of you, there are quite a few like fluid spaces that we occupy, and it's not just collaborators that we're meeting for the first time that we work with. We may work with people who are very close to us and have a personal relationship to us. So I like that you also mentioned that you're a friend and a brother as well. You mentioned also that you are a collaborator. Could you talk a little bit more about some of the different people that you collaborate with in the Indian arts space? Are they exclusively within Indian arts, or do you collaborate with people in other art forms as well?
Well, I guess in the Indian arts, in the classical art space, every performance is a collaboration because, I mean, you're working with different co-artists, but it's not, I guess it's not really considered a collaboration. I don't know why actually it should be, because we're all coming together and it's not like I'm dictating everything. There is an interplay, there is a dialogue. That's something that should be changed in the classical world. But formally, I would say I collaborate with people like Akram Khan, Tigran Hamazi, and they're kind of not in the classical space, more in the contemporary side. Anushka Shankar and Ravi Shankar. Those are some of the people I've collaborated with. And of course, my sister, Maithili Prakash, my mother, Vijay Prakash.
Yeah. So can I come in and actually ask one question here? So when you say collaborative, or whether we actually mean like formal collaboration or just it feels collaborative, what are characteristics of like a good collaboration? Just a couple words that come to mind.
That's a good question. I think dialogue, equality, not feeling superior, kind of having open space for everyone to have their opinion. Yeah, and I think that's something that kind of equality needs to improve in the classical world. There is such a big hierarchy with main artists, Pakavadyam, even the way we sit on the stage. It's something that I haven't implemented yet, because it's still things that are going on in my head, but I think it's very important and important things to talk about.
Actually, I have a follow-up question / related tangent to that as well. So, you mentioned that you view personally that when you get on stage with people, you view that as a form of collaboration, which it absolutely is. So I was wondering, even in those settings where, collaboration perhaps happens for only 3 hours and you don't know the person before, you don't know the person after maybe, versus when you know the people on stage with you or know the people that are collaborating with you, how does your conduct change? Does it change? And do you hold yourself to similar standards, different standards? Do you feel more free, less free to interact with those people or not?
That's a good question. I think we do, in the classical space, we do collaborate with people we've never met a lot because, the music glues us together. It's the glue that holds us together, that respect for the music. And I think, obviously, you feel a sense of more, more formalness with people you've never met, where more formality. Whereas when I'm working with people I've intimately known and I interact with on a friend basis, I think there's more risk taking. There's more space given to letting the other person take a lead because you've had these conversations before. Whereas when it's with someone you've never met, you kind of follow this given structure, which sometimes can be very hierarchical. Because we haven't had those conversations. So I will have to take the lead more if I'm working with a violinist or mridangist that I've never met before, and we haven't had these conversations about how the music, we want the music to flow. And so we go with just the given structure, the format. And that format itself is, unfortunately, it's beautiful, but it is flawed. It is very main artist, vocalist centric. And I think it's nice to have collaborations where you're discussing things before the performance. And I feel like even in the Indians, I might be going off topic, but even in the Indian space, I think there's something we look down upon pre-performance dialogue. There's a big there's a big deal given to just coming on stage and just playing the music and not discussing the repertoire, not discussing maybe an interesting way one person can accompany the song or one person can switch the lead role. And I do this a lot with my contemporary work. We don't just go on stage and perform. We discuss before the set list, what songs we're going to do, who's going to come in when. We kind of have a general roadmap, which makes you more comfortable to it makes everyone a little more comfortable. And you don't want to define it so clearly so you take off this spontaneity. But I think we should, in the classical arts, we shouldn't look down upon dialogue before concerts and kind of actually getting to know each other.
Yeah. Do you think that kind of dialogue, preparation, coordination before a performance, do you consider that a form of professional conduct in and of itself? Just making sure that you're communicating with your collaborators ahead of time.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. And it's something that is, I don't get why it's not a thing in the, for me, Carnatic world. It's just part of the culture, not talk musical. You can exchange pleasantries before the concert, but it's almost like, why would you tell me the concert list? Let's just go on stage and do it, which is really fun and exciting. But I think it is professional, it is important, and it's nice to discuss or have the space to discuss and not feel like you have to hide everything and save it for the stage. So it is nice, and I think that is part of communication and part of making your team feel involved. Like it's a team effort. It's not just my show, you're playing for me.
Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit about, I'm curious myself to hear a little bit about your collaboration with your own sister, because you did mention you're a brother and your sister is an artist. Yeah. So having that personal and professional lines sort of coming together there are a lot of people in our Indian art spaces that deal with that. So they're either working with their husbands or wives, or they're working with, brothers and sisters. We see a lot of couple artists, a lot of sibling artists together, both dance and music. So how do you feel about working with your sister, and how do you still ensure professional conduct there?
Yeah, it's a very tricky situation. It seems very easy, but oh, your brother sister must be really nice and easy, but it's actually very difficult, and we're realizing it more now. The beautiful part of it is obviously the intimacy, the candid conversations, the proximity, the access to each other's creative processes. The difficulties is time commitment, seriousness in the space, finding the right space, finding the right time, and I guess kind of showing appreciation, encouragement. Those are all things that we kind of have grappled with because we are kind of like we're me and my sister kind of jest with each other. We make fun of each other. We're very honest with each other. And I think sometimes when in the art space, when it is a vulnerable space, and sometimes the way, I'm not saying you shouldn't be honest with each other, but the way you deliver that honesty comes with a little bit more of a cushion, with a little bit more understanding of what that person needs, rather than, let's say I didn't like something, rather than saying, oh man, that was crap. What was that? That could personally hurt that artist and make them feel insecure. But if, for instance, I was cooking a meal, and cooking is not my thing, I don't care if she says, oh, your meal was crap, that was so bad. So there's a difference. And I would say that. So it's just teetering that line of how you give feedback, how you share your opinions, your artistic opinions. That's one area that's been tricky, and we've been navigating it. Another is the kind of attention, the presence you give to the art space, because she may come in, we're in the kitchen, I'm making something, she may want to discuss an idea, but I'm cooking, I'm thinking about making my tea, I'm thinking about making lunch, I'm not fully present. So I'm just like, but we haven't set a formal time, but it's nice to have that dialogue whenever we want, but then again, I'm not fully present. I may be on my phone, and sometimes that's tricky because when we actually go to the formal space, I may be on my phone while we're there, and that's something that I've unknowingly done, and we've addressed that before. I might, every time we discuss things, I'm kind of like doing other things. So I guess that translates into the formal space, which is not okay. And also the fact that, I think because in the beginning, we found a groove, but then as we started working with other professionals, we started seeing the professional relationship, and we kind of wanted that too, our brother-sister relationship. So setting time to work and treating it like it doesn't come very naturally, but treating my sister like another professional that she is. I know she is. But to actually turn that switch on, okay, you're not the brother now, you're the collaborator, you're the artist. It takes an actual effort, and it's been a little bit tricky, but I think we've had discussions, we've had fights, we've had we've had therapy even. So it's important to discuss these to have these conversations with people. And I'm not only the brother, like even my friends, some of my best friends in college are my musical collaborators now. And rehearsals, we have to kind of switch off that kind of friend jokey attitude for a bit, and it's hard. Sometimes it's very difficult because I don't want to be that band leader, that strict guy. I want to be joking, but when we get into that professional space, it's hard to navigate being the friend and being the artist. So
thank you for saying that. Actually, that reminds me of a conversation I've had with Parul recently also about this, and creating that accountability in spaces that you teach. Can you just go into tangibly how you do that? Because you talk about this dialogue, this communication, how regular the communication should be between parent and teacher, how you make space for that parent to hold you accountable, and also working with friends and students and colleagues. So can you talk a little bit about that overlap from the perspective that you come in?
Sure. I'll first, sorry.
Oh, it's Carl.
Sorry. Yes. Okay.
I guess I'll start with the collaboration with my company members and other musicians. So most of my company members are students of mine who studied with me for numerous years, from 8 to 15 years. And so over the years, we're in the same kind of age range. We've become very good friends. One of my dancers is my best friend. She's no longer dancing. She's in Costa Rica, but others are still a part of the company. And, there is a fine line. And I don't think we've ever actually talked about it. But again, this idea of respecting one another and respecting our roles, right? So they know that I'm coming in as also their teacher and now a choreographer. But, the way that I like to choreograph is it's about the collaboration, right? I don't want my choreography to be about just my thoughts and my own voice. I feel it's very important that the choreography that I create, that I make, is also the voice of all of the artists. And recently, it's been very interesting because I've been using dancers. I've been auditioning dancers because I need more dancers. And so I've been meeting dancers who are not used to my process, and they're trained in Bharatanatyam, some in Kathak. And I've had the experience where they want to come in and just learn a piece that we're performing. They don't want to collaborate. They don't want their voice to be heard. They just want to be taught A, B, C, let's do it. And so for me, that's been very difficult because that's not my process, right? I want my dancers to be thinking about the work. And so that has been a little bit challenging, and not with all dancers, but with some. And so, we're working around it, and then it's just kind of a new thing that I'm kind of learning, because most of the dancers, as I said, are coming from my training where I want them to be thinking about the work on a very personal level. And then as far as, collaborating with musicians, I collaborate with musicians. And as I said, my extended space is my parents' restaurant. And that has been my space for about 15 years now. And I feel very fortunate to have the space in New York City. It's a huge space. I have lovely floors. I have mirrors. And we are the best fed dance company. We take breaks. We have chai. We have samosas, whatever you want, a dosa. So very, very fortunate to have that. And so there is this space that we create that in most of my musicians that I collaborate, I've known for many, many years. So they are also my friends, and we do break and we enjoy our time with one another. But when we're working, right, it's clear that now it's like you switch gears very quickly. And then I think, again, it comes down to this real concept of respecting each other, right? Having respect for one another's thoughts. And all of my musicians, really, I ask them to, I kind of, as a choreographer, and if this is my work that I'm commissioning them for, I do, in a sense, have this final say, but they have so much freedom to bring in their thoughts. And I think that's really important for me, right? I think these different ways of thinking about the piece, about the narrative, I really enjoy and I welcome.
Mm-hmm. And I actually, thank you for saying that about friends and, colleagues. I actually wanted to know more about you said you had formal training, but you were trained in India, not in the States. So can you talk a little bit about the type of formal training that you had in India, how that space was, how did the teacher create a space of accountability, and how does that look different in your own teaching practice here? I know we talked a little bit about the different ways that you took and evolved your teacher's way of accountability into your own practice. I think that's really important for teachers listening here today to hear how they continue to have accountability in their spaces with their students and their parents. So if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so, one thing I think as an artist, as a human, we're continuously evolving. I hope we're progressing for the most part. I feel I've had an excellent training. I'm so blessed to have Kumiben, Kumadani Lakia, as my guru. And I've been studying with her for now, I still study with her when I can, for 20 plus years. And I've spent so much time. She has a dance institute in Ahmedabad. And, she really runs a very tight ship. She's stern, very, very disciplined. She has huge expectations for anyone that walks in through her doors, and standards need to be met. And I think as we were talking about, I don't know necessarily what the conversation she has with her teachers and her musicians, but there's a code of conduct that we all abide by. And it's very clear, right? It's very clear that these are her expectations. This is the criteria. And that doesn't mean that, it's just a formal space and that there isn't space for us to dialogue. I don't know how much you know about Kumiben, but she is quite an innovator. And, I've always had the freedom to be thinking outside of the box. She wants that. She expects that from her dancers. She wants them to create. And I feel, very fortunate to have that dialogue. And we would always have breaks every day too. That's actually how I began to drink chai, is that I was told in our breaks I used to eat oranges. And so one of the dancers, a senior dancer, was like, listen, if you want to be a part of Kadam, which is her dance school name, she's like, you have to drink chai with us. So, it was kind of just a thing and that's how I started drinking really sweet Gujarati chai. So, we always had this space. There's a beautiful courtyard. We'd sit and we'd dialogue with one another. So I think she just had this really beautiful blend of being able to talk with her students and her musicians. But at the same time, there's a clear code of conduct that everyone really does, abide by.
Right, and that was an institution space, right? That was an institution setting. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just wondering if this code of conduct was codified somewhere. Was it something that was said to the students before they came in?
Yeah,
or just unwritten?
Yeah, right. No, I don't think so. I don't know. As I was saying that, I don't know what her conversation is with her teachers and her musicians. I personally don't know that, but I do, as we all know, things happen that shouldn't have happened, and do continue to happen. But I will say that I always felt very safe there. I went right after high school, and I always felt very safe. I was actually supposed to go to Delhi to study, and then I was told, some parents and other artists told my parents that it's just not. I was going to a specific institute, and they're like, it's not a safe environment. And then I started looking elsewhere. But I've never had any issues as such. So I do feel very fortunate. As I do a lot of teaching myself, and I think I mentioned I teach in all sectors of pedagogy. I teach a public school teacher as a teaching artist, and I teach in a studio, and I also teach as an adjunct professor. So all the intentions of my teaching differs, but I do feel that my code of conduct is really my responsibility, my accountability, that our students can come to me, feel comfortable enough to come to me if they have any form of issue, and also create this environment that clearly states that there's no place for any kind of violation whether it's verbal or sexual. And as dance being that it is a physical form, when I'm creating with my artists, right, you really need, and not just dance, I think Aditya mentioned, vulnerability. To be able to create, to really get into that process, you need to be vulnerable, right? And in order to get there, you need to feel safe. So I feel that, it is my responsibility to create that space.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah. And also you were saying in terms of like parents or students disagreeing with you, what is your process like? Do you allow parents to sit in their students' classes, and how do you balance that with parents? Can you quickly talk about that?
Sure. So what I do is I do not have parents sit in my classes on a daily class base, because I do feel that it takes away from my relationship with the students. I want the students to be able to be free with me, and to be free with the other students. So when your parent is there, that's just not going to happen. However, I do also, being a parent myself, feel like it's important, for parents to know what's happening in the class, how the teacher is also interacting, what is his or her pedagogy methods. So I welcome my students my parents to come in and watch the class on a monthly basis.
And then you're saying that you take that feedback very seriously, which I think it says a lot about your conduct, right? I feel when I was speaking to you.
Right. So I feel, I've had my own, I've been a student, I'm still a student. I've had many experiences as a student, and I still do. And I think it's really important, and as I started this conversation, is that we're continuously evolving, right? I hope we're continuously learning. And I want to I've had an excellent, and I still have an excellent teacher who I feel so fortunate, but I want to take what I have learned from her a step further. And I think that's really important. I think we're continuously changing. We have different expectations, right? Things that were okay 20 years ago, they're not okay now, right? And so we need to be moving, and I think we constantly have to check ourselves, right? We have to check our behavior, and we have to allow for spaces for that to occur. Right. So the same thing as having teachers come in, and not just teachers, right? I do a lot of things where I teach teachers, but the same thing, I can have a mentor come in and watch me, right? And say, well, hey, listen, I do this, because it's very hard, right? To have that critical eye on yourself. So I think it's very important to have other people come and say, hey, well, I think you can improve on this. And I think the idea of being receptive to it is very important.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. And now I kind of want to have Priyanka help us transition to some experiences that Shiv has had as a more part-time artist. So yes, go ahead, Priyanka.
Yeah. I want to highlight how interesting and great it is, probably based on your experiences, how you've been able to be trained in such a formal institute, but also be able to have that personal and healthy relationship with other students, with your own guru, like using the extended space of like drinking chai in between classes. I think that really gets to what we're trying to discuss, of how like just because you're in a specific type of space, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's professional conduct. But that's not to say that you can be in an extended or fluid space and not have professional conduct. Like clearly you've been able to develop these personal relationships, take some of those lessons into your own dance academy and your own dance school, and hold yourself accountable. And I just want to highlight that. So now getting to Shiv, I know when we talked earlier this week, we were talking a lot about your own formal dance education and how you've been in a lot of fluid spaces also. How a lot of your classes have happened in your teacher's house, but your teacher also has a formal academy space. Could you talk a little bit more about that and what your classes have looked like and your student-teacher relationship over the years?
Yeah, totally. So when I started taking lessons, my guru, Srimati Archana Zorekar, who has her academy in New Jersey, she was like just beginning her academy. So it was out of her townhome at the time. And it was probably like 10, 15 students. And so I think taking classes in that informal home space kind of leads itself to a level of like intimacy and a taste of, especially when we talk about Indian arts. I think in India, there's like such a culture around the guru-shishya relationship and like this idea of students, you know, going to the guru's home for sometimes to stay there for years, to like really day in and day out, like imbibe themselves with this art, right? And so I think that's why like a lot of Indian arts in the diasporic communities are like taught through the guru's home. And so it allows like that level of intimacy and allows like a taste of that guru-shishya relationship as if it was like a residency in their home. And it's really nice to build this trust with your guru, build that vulnerability, like if you're able to. And I think obviously a lot of this comes down to also at the same time being aware of the power dynamics and that they need to be kept in check. I was fortunate enough to, you know, have that never be an issue and just be able to build that trust with my guru. But I think especially when students are like children or students are minors, it's even more important to keep this dynamic in check when you are operating in those informal spaces. But yeah, I have really appreciated having that space in the beginning of my like dance education. Later on, we moved into a more formal studio space, and now the academy operates out of like its own standalone studio. But I think it's important, even when we talk about, you know, professionalizing this space, doing it in a way that's meaningful and significant and giving credence to what already exists, and then kind of thinking about when we remove too much of the personal, what are we comfortable losing? Like, are we trying to westernize at that point? What elements of the culture and are we doing away with? So I think as much as we talk about obviously creating these safe spaces, creating these workspaces that are safe, also taking with us those parts of the personal that are important.
Yeah. And when you talk about like having operated in a lot of these fluid spaces, having had class in your teacher's own townhome before moving into this a more formal studio space, you had mentioned that you always felt safe within these spaces. Was there any, and this is similar to other questions that we discussed towards the beginning of this panel, but having that conduct between you and your teacher, that trust, being able to build that, was that something that was explicitly discussed between like, parents and your teacher? Or was it more of an implicit code of conduct that your teacher would follow, or that everyone in the space was expected to abide by?
Yeah, I don't know. It definitely wasn't explicitly discussed. There was no like code of conduct that I had to sign, or like, I don't think it was discussed. I think it was before any, like the academy was really formalized in that way. I don't know if she does that now, but I wouldn't think there is like a formal code of conduct that's like asked to be signed by parents. I think it was very much implicit. And I also started when I was 6. So I very much just saw her as a maternal figure and gave her the same respect I would give to my parents. And I think she is a very strict, like authoritarian kind of teacher. And so because of that, there was a level of like, well, I feel like the first part of my training, there was like a level of fear and like wanting to, I was like held to a standard, and I needed to, you know, provide that standard, and I needed to practice and like building this discipline. And so I think because I saw it as such a like strict teacher-student relationship, there was no room for gray space or any kind of like misconduct. And I think that's really the responsibility of the educator or the teacher to set the tone. Because in a student and teacher space where the student is a minor, which has been my experience, you don't go in with much power. You're kind of like at the hands of your guru, your teacher. And so if it's their informal space that you're entering, it's their rules. And if those are implicitly stated and not, you know, written out directly in a code of conduct, it's even more important to, set that tone from the get-go.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question that's perhaps a little tougher. But like, you said that they hold the power, for example, and things like that. There's a shifted power dynamic, and especially when you have minors, put yourself in, for example, your parents' shoes. You said you started when you were 6, sorry. Can you imagine what might have been going through your parents' mind when they're dropping you off to somebody that they perhaps don't know what the teacher might be like, and if there's any potential, like, how do you judge as a parent, for example, to whether this person would be somebody that you would be comfortable dropping off your kid with, for example?
Yeah, for sure. I think my parents were definitely allowed to sit in, like my mom would sit in the classes early on, which I think is really important. And I think that comfortability and that vulnerability needs to be, like, that relationship needs to be developed, I think, before that trust can then take off. And then they can drop me off and be like, oh, I know this teacher, we have a relationship, I can trust that they're going to behave correctly and like with a certain level of conduct. And so I think in the beginning, they definitely sat and like observed, and the teacher was open to that because obviously she was a parent also, and so was probably aware that that relationship needs to be built and that trust isn't there as like a given, which I think is really important. Yeah.
And in terms of being like part-time, can you talk a little bit about sort of what the challenges are of being part-time and having another career, not necessarily depending on this for an income necessarily, but what do opportunities look like? How can you have a dialogue in certain spaces with people who have more power than you, let's say like an organizer or someone, and still make sure that you have an equal say and they don't feel like they're having an upper hand and just controlling your performance entirely? Because I know a lot of young performers and people who are doing part-time work have that sort of struggle. And I'm not sure how much of that constitutes as misconduct, but like if you can talk a little bit about the challenges there, that would be good.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I think in like highly technical forms, like Indian classical forms or specifically Kathak, it's kind of about like two things come to mind. So I feel like a certain level of skill or training is required from my experience to be able to, even enter like a professional space. And then I think it's on the artist's responsibility to like keep art a big part of their life if it isn't their full-time job, if it isn't their profession. If you want to occupy a professional space. And I think the training here is really important because it garners a level of respect from the public and from stakeholders like in this space. So from event organizers or from anyone else, like, oh, this person has been, training for 15 years and has this and this degree. And so even if I'm not maybe able to do gigs as often and build my portfolio that way, I still have this training and like skill that can kind of speak for itself. So I think in this specific space, that is really important. For like artists who are trying to do this, I think a lot of it comes down to like also how you think about yourself and your identity as an artist. So before anyone is able to kind of like form opinions on you, are you steadfast in your abilities, in your creativity, in your talent to be able to fight against this grain and fight against, occupying this amateur or pre-professional space, and instead think yourself worthy of being able to occupy this professional space that's probably harder to reach. And that being said, like I still struggle with that constantly, and there have been like really great opportunities that I've had to pass up or I couldn't take part in because I was enrolled in school full time, or I was doing like research or community work or something, and that probably dropped me a couple rungs on the professional dance ladder, but it also brought me closer to my goals in my path in medicine. So I think you also have to be at the same time like realistic about how much of the quote unquote like professional space you can occupy, and to not spread yourself too thin or not expect things that are expect things that you would expect from yourself if you were in this space full time and if it was your profession. And in my opinion, at least for people who aren't doing this like as a profession, as their full-time thing, I don't think art making should be like another stress-inducing source of, or like another source of stress in your life. Like, I think art making should be reserved for, this form of expression. And I feel like then it becomes kind of counterproductive if on top of your work, your other, passion and work, this is also causing stress. So I think it's about being realistic and then also like forming your identity as an artist. Yeah.
Thank you. And actually, I have a question for Shreya from an arts management perspective here. Like, if you are trying to help an artist who is not full time, is that something that you do? And how do you help them how do you help other people see that they are also professionals too, even though they are only part time? Because often we think of full time artists as like the only category, but we have a lot of people in our space who are part time artists. So how do you help them briefly? How do you help them?
It's a pretty loaded question, but it really depends on where they want to be and how serious they want to be in their art, right? If this is just something they're doing on the side, there's nothing much I can help them with because they're not serious professionals. They're not looking to generate revenue, to create a brand, to sort of set themselves up and position themselves in the market. So I would say but if they're trying to do both, then definitely it's tougher because they have to not only exhibit professionalism, but develop value in their art and how they sort of position themselves, right? And I mean, anybody in the sector will probably take a full-time artist more seriously. When you say, hey, I'm an XYZ, I'm a chartered accountant, etc., and I'm doing this also, there's a different kind of respect that comes when people say that because they admire the fact that you can manage two professions. So yeah, it's not easy, and it really depends on what goals the artist has and how far they're willing and how hard they're willing to work towards it. And then we work with them and develop a strategic plan on how they're going to achieve those goals.
Okay, thank you.
This actually, if I could jump in, this reminds me of something, Shiv, you said earlier in the week when we were speaking about this concept of a double-edged sword, how you perform at a very high level, but because you're not performing full-time, it means that you have to advocate for yourself even more with organizers and when you're seeking performing opportunities.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think a lot of artists deal with that dichotomy a lot. So going into that, I kind of want to transition into our more tangible takeaways section with dialogue between Samita and Rashmi. So I'm going to kind of talk to both of you in parallel here. So Samita, I know you were talking a lot about what ethical professional conduct means to you and what those words are. So if we can remind the audience what those words are again, and then talk a little bit about what exactly an inclusive space should be and some of the microaggressions in dance, and how do we set that zero tolerance in these spaces? How can we make that space actually be more professional with a better conduct? So can you speak a little bit on that?
So yes, I had a lot of thoughts even as I was listening to Parul and Aditya and Shiv speak, especially about feeling safe in their teachers' spaces where they learned. And some of the words that I did share in the beginning was inclusivity and safety. And what I kept thinking was that the way we navigate the field, at least in the Indian context, I know, that safety is very conditional. It's also very dependent on how you are located in the social landscape, in the Indian social landscape, which determines how you are experiencing safety in this field. Yep. So, some of us might have the privilege to feel safe at all places, but I feel that especially a lot of the classical dance forms, which are predominantly seen at least as Hindu dance forms, but also have a lot of other minority bodies who are practicing these forms. Like I feel like all dance class spaces may not be very diverse, but I am sure that there are people who are, who are non-Hindus who practice the dance form. So I'm just thinking of safety in a lot of ways, and like safety is political, safety is also emotional. So how do you feel emotionally safe in this space? How do you know that this dance, because when you're training in Bharatanatyam, you're also taught to embody religiosity. You are taught to import and what is known as, what is seen as Hindu religiosity. And like if I have a Catholic friend who's learning Bharatanatyam, often for, even though she spent like many years training under one teacher, this is like an awkward space which never gets addressed. And I feel like all these account for safety, and safety cannot be conditional. It cannot, like, and freedom cannot be conditional. It's not like you're safe only if you are a so and so person. It shouldn't be that you're safe. Often we feel like we're safe because it's okay. We usually go by the rules. We know we are not supposed to question our teachers. But will you still be safe if you really are, you want to tell your teacher that, you know, I was really hurt by what you said. I was really hurt that you put me in the back of this choreography because of my body type. Because, so these are also the kinds of conversations that, so I navigate the field primarily as a dance writer, and these are the stories. I spend a lot of time talking to dancers who dance and teach professionally. And these are the kinds of stories of threat and vulnerability that I always hear from a lot of dancers who are also my friends. So so lack of safety or threat need not always be explicitly sexual abuse, right? So one thing I've heard a lot is very subtle ways of body shaming in dance classes, because yes, dance is ableist. We privilege able bodies. We privilege even super able bodies in dance. But like some subtle things that I've seen is, I recently heard that one of the dancers who is a trained Kathak dancer was not taken into one of the productions, and she was wondering why she couldn't make sense of it. And later when she went and asked the choreographer, she was very like lightly told that, you know, it's really not about your skill. It's really not about your skill. We just needed people who are thin and tall. Or it was just a choreographic choice. Another thing I've seen in like my 2-3 years of reviewing for the newspaper is that always somehow, because there's so many mythological stories that get performed in stage popularly in South India, at least in Bangalore, that's where I was a reviewer. I have seen often that, say, a dark complexion person is almost like very often given the role of a demon, and it's never said, right? It's never spoken about, but I'm sure it hurts at some level. It's this level of stereotyping which, and when I say violence and aggression, so I am just wondering, how do we make dance spaces which are really aware of even these kinds of politics, which where so this is the kind of stuff I was thinking about when I was saying safe and inclusive. And one thing that one of my friends was telling me, I don't know if this is really a solution, but this is something that she has done in her own dance space, is she has actually put up the preamble of the Indian Constitution in her studio where students come. So you know that it's there that it's a democratic and a secular space. And I think that in the kind of times that we live in, it does give a sense of comfort to, say, a minority body, or say a Catholic or a Muslim who's entering a Bharatanatyam dance class, to see that, okay, maybe I'm not seeing this in other places, but okay, here is someone, I know that I will not be targeted here for my identity, even in subtle ways.
Not just that, right, Namita? It's also about reminding the Hindus and the Indians about their rights as well and their privilege in that sector too.
Right. And I also want to come back to this choreographic choice. You used some words that I just wrote down here: choreographic choice, teaching choices, being in agreement, and disagreement and how that changes the nature of the professional space. I know I've actually seen a lot of this happen and heard this happen as well, where people bucket that choreographic choice, teaching choice, and agreement as like that's just the respect I deserve for being a professional, right? If a teacher is saying, oh, that's just my professional way of teaching, or that's just my professional way of choreographing or conducting a class, they're bucketing those terms under the term professional. So Rashmi, I want to kind of ask you, is that truly professional? Is it truly professional if you're still having discomfort in a space? And that's why we're talking a lot about safety here, is because we're looking at ethical professional conduct, right? And a big part of that is safety. So for all the audience members that are listening, they're like, what does safety have to do with this? That's the professional conduct that we're alluding to here that actually allows for creativity and respective time and the respect to really flourish. So if you feel discomfort or disrespected, is it still considered a professional space? How do you handle that, and where does that come from? Can you comment a little bit on that with your work with survivors?
Yeah. I think before I start, when Samita was giving these examples of across religion, I recently watched this film, Mir Aksam. I think many of you must have watched, which is by Shabana Azmi. And this really that gets into the issue. And that's the first time I looked at this whole issue in an art space. Very interesting movie. Now coming to, I think, your question, and when I was listening to everyone, I think my mind was going back to that why today there is a need to discuss about different kinds of relationship and the space of respect, the space of professionalism, safe or a space for safety. It is, and that's why we have them in silos, that we have an act on domestic violence, we have laws on sexual harassment in public place, or then we talk about workplace, laws. And from where all this is coming, I think and why there is a need to address them, but then the overall underlying thing is that irrespective of that, and many of you were talking also that our identities, we all have multiple identities, and those identities keep changing, and they are very relational. Okay, they are like in relation to something. We don't say I'm a mother in isolation. It is in vis-a-vis some relationship. Now, if in all the relationships if we all as human beings see that, okay, these are some of the non-negotiable values, which is the value of respect, which is the value of consent, and not only consent of taking consent, but giving consent, the whole idea and value of respecting boundaries, being more, I think respect is something my mind keeps going, because our disrespectful behavior arises towards somebody because of the stereotypes we hold for a particular gender, for a particular caste, community, and it all rises from, the power. So I think till the time we say, because when everyone was talking about, different kind of these professional relationships, honestly, as a person working on women's rights, the first thing which was coming to my mind is that, okay, if we are saying that we want to discuss about all of this in professional relationship, then do we mean that in personal relationship, all these behaviors get a sanction? Okay.
That's a great point.
That's my whole point. It is just because he's my son, because he's my partner, and these are very informal, non-professional relationships. So it just gives me the social sanction of the way I want to behave. Like, many a times I hear in workshops and trainings also that, it's just like a joke. Okay, I'm not able to crack jokes in official space. I mean, and the whole thing is an okay and not okay joke and a not okay language is not okay and should not be okay anywhere. And not okay conduct should not be. And what happens is, and people say, but then how we talk to each other? And then the whole thing goes to that there are certain things which we don't talk in certain places, because there are certain norms attached to them. I will not go and, share a joke in front of my mother or father, because I know that there are certain norms which I'm not, then why can't they be applicable across relationship, and why it needs to be defined into these silos? And going back to your question is that when we deal with all these cases, I think this is one of the things which happens is when we are like, having these investigations and all these complex, relationships when they come, and the person is like, but then she's my friend.
Yeah.
But then she's also my friend. So when there's also my friend, that means the relationship of even friendship should not give any sanction and should respect boundaries.
Thank you so much for saying that. That's literally gold to say. Thank you so much for saying that. And what I actually really wanted to know is just actually from all the panelists with a show of hands, like you've signed a contract, right? I mean, who here has signed a contract to get into some sort of work? Can you just raise your hand? Everyone, probably, right? You've signed a contract, right? So how does that contract really mean that this space is professional? Just because I'm doing that one action, how professional is it by just having a contract? What is outlined on the contract, and is that something that's allowing both parties to actually have a say in that? Right? Samita was really talking about this earlier, the power dynamic. And when we're taking an unorganized space and we're trying to organize it a little bit more, we're trying to put in professional practices like, signing a contract, for example, or other professional practices. It's really easy for that to be exploitative and us to not even realize that. Just because someone's handing you a contract doesn't mean that they automatically are respecting you and they're acting professionally. The respect is something that they have to actually intentionally put into that and give you space to contradict what they have said. So Samita was talking about that earlier. And I wanted to ask Rashmi, do you have any specific ideas for how to take a space like the Indian arts that's so diverse and in some cases a little unorganized, but for good reasons too, like camaraderie? How do we take that, and what are some professional practices that are actually healthy? And if someone is extending a contract or someone is doing something professional or saying, I'm a professional too, what should I expect from them when they're saying that in terms of like the workspace and how they're conducting themselves in that space?
So I think I will first go to the contract part. I think when you mentioned about the contract part, and this is what increasingly when we work with even the companies, the corporate sector, I'm talking about the organized sector also, is we tell them that in your contract, it should specifically mention that, the relationship is zero tolerant to any kind of, inappropriate behavior. We have a policy in place. There is a redressal mechanism in place. So one is what goes on paper. And then also how that entire transaction happens between the two people, between them, the contract is being signed. There also should be some core values. And now some core values are written, which can be written down in the contract. And then there are certain core values which are left out through behaviors and practice. So I think they have to be done in both ways, the way we conduct ourselves and also how that is formalized maybe in the relationships we have. So when we look at this POSH Act, and that's what increasingly we say, any kind of contract you have, the first thing is that all these things should be mentioned in your formal contract. Because somewhere, suppose today I am signing a contract with Janani, and if she is giving me, or suppose let's say I was coming, a lot of these workshops today when you held this, you're holding this pack, a lot of time invitations come and then there will be like a clause saying this space is going to be zero tolerant to any kind of, and as per the POSH Act also. Now, when I am coming from outside, I read, it also tells me something about this group, about this space. Yes. And it really makes me think that, yes, they are aware about it and I have to be like, I can report and also I have to be watchful about my behavior. So I think it's a quite mix of formal and informal and through behaviors and through formalizing things.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. Priyanka, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I have a follow-up question on that for Rashmi. So you mentioned the POSH Act specifically, like building that into contracts. But what about contracts that may traverse different countries? What if a performer is native to one country, they're traveling to another country to perform, to enter into some kind of a professional collaboration? What are some of the elements then that could be introduced into contracts that they have between different parties? What law would apply in that case?
So suppose, let's say, the contract is being issued by an institution or a company in India and somebody is coming from outside. Now, if the party who's issuing the contract, can specifically mention that, yes, according to the POSH Act in India, we are zero tolerant to any kind of inappropriate, disrespectful behaviors. And then, and in that case, it will say that the law of the land will apply. So if the person has come from another country in India and then the incident happens, then and then if suppose the behavior was conducted by that person who had come from outside, then the complainant will apply the law of her land, if their land. And also if the person says, okay, I don't trust the law here, the redressal mechanism here, then that person also has the right to go back to their country and then follow the procedure. But normally it will be the law of the land where the contract is signed.
Thank you for that.
Jump in and add one thing about what Janani was saying as to, is it enough? Just because you sign a contract doesn't mean it's formal. I think it's like what maybe Rashmi was touching about a little bit, is that people are not formal. People are not respectful of space. And the contract brings that seriousness into the relationship. That's something that I don't have to, like Aditya was saying, instead of saying, going into a rehearsal and saying, hey, all phones off, you guys are here for 1.5 hours and we need to practice. If we have that in a contract, I feel like we don't have to seem like we're being strict bosses, right? And it sort of just brings everybody on the same table without feeling like this, that one of us is sort of taking the lead and everybody else is a follower. It's like we're all agreeing that this is what we need to do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. In the interest of time, I'm actually going to have Shreya and Guhan do the wrap up for us after we take a couple of audience questions. So I'm going to have Neha come in. I just want to make sure we're accounting for the audience listening here, asking a couple of questions to the panelists. And then after that, have Guhan and Shreya kind of recap with their background and do the takeaways at the end, if that's okay. Thank you. Go ahead, Neha.
All right, everyone. So we got a bunch of really great audience questions. So I'm just going to start off with something that's really simple. More than a question, I think this is maybe even something for CAREspaces and SNS to ponder on. So this is from the GD Classical Dance Institute. They're asking, and they were wondering if any of us on the panel or members of CAREspaces or SNS could create a paid module for new arts administrators to learn the basics. And I think, Shreya, this is kind of in your realm specifically.
Why not? I would love to do that, and I will do it very soon.
Awesome. Okay, so our next question is from Kripa Ravi. She's asking, when you're performing with people of different levels of experience and expertise in a particular art form, how do you ensure that the workspace is conducive to learning and growth, especially during practice and rehearsal when artists make themselves quite vulnerable? Making mistakes and learning from them, how do you make the space feel safe for constructive criticism and feedback? I think this is something almost all of the panelists touched upon to some extent, especially the performing artists. So if anyone wants to jump in particularly, please go ahead.
Can you repeat the question just one more time, Neha? And maybe you can direct it to someone.
Yeah, okay. So Kripa Ravi is asking, when you're performing with people of different levels of expertise in a particular art form, how do you ensure that the workplace is conducive to learning and growth, especially during practice and rehearsal when artists make themselves quite vulnerable, making mistakes and learning from them? How do you make this space feel safer for constructive criticism and feedback? Maybe Parul or Samita.
Parul, actually. Yeah. Parul had some great insights on that earlier. Go ahead, Parul.
So I'm not clear with the question, but I don't generally have students on different levels or professionals dancing with students. So I'm not exactly sure if that's what her question is, because I don't feel that's conducive to pedagogy. I don't think that's a good way of learning. Okay. I do think that it would create lots of insecurities, but I don't know if I'm understanding the question correctly.
I think she is saying that, there's sometimes, especially in Bharatanatyam, there are times where people are interacting, like students are interacting with professional artists within a production or something like that. And they all have different roles. So maybe Samita, just thinking about that question, is that something that how to create a safe space for them with varied expertise in the mix? Is there something you can think of? There's no right or wrong answer here.
I think it really depends on the kind of work that they are all engaging in together. I'm sure that I feel like, for example, an improv exercise, if you're thinking of an improv exercise when they're all involved, in which it doesn't really matter how much more experience or less experience you have, but you can respond to it from wherever you're situated in that moment. I don't think that would matter. I'm not sure how exactly to respond to this, but I think one way to go about it is to know that having less experience is not a bad thing. Or having more experience is really not a virtue, really. If I think that is kind of made explicit by the person who is facilitating or who is the holder of that space, I think it's really up to them, the person who's holding that space, to make sure that nobody feels less or more because of the experience, really. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. Neha, can we take the next question, please?
Yep, just give me a second. All right. So our next question is, I think maybe Shiv, you can actually answer this question because you specifically have done some work on this topic during your Fulbright. So one of our audience members says, it's interesting to bring up the fluid relationships and how it can affect the spaces. Given the arts diversity, how do these spaces accommodate gender fluidity within the LGBTQI community members? And have you seen it change over the course of your career as a performing artist?
Whoa. That's a loaded question. I think, my specific work looked at the kind of inherent fluidity in the vocabulary that exists in Kathak already, just in terms of there's always this masculine feminine divide in terms of when we perform expressive pieces. There's Shankar, Parvati, there's always within the Hindu mythology too, that's put into the form, oftentimes choreographed into the form. And I think I was curious to see, when I was in England doing this research, there are performers who are coming up now who, one performer who I did a case study on performs in drag. And so he finds that a really cool explorative, way of exploring different characters or taking on this feminine identity for a piece. It kind of takes it one step further than what's already happening in Kathak, which is the pantomime that we use to portray a certain storyboard. If you also do that with your costume and makeup, what happens then? So kind of blurring that line. There's another performer who I was working with who performs queer narratives. So looking at, instead of taking on the persona of Radha, kind of pining after Krishna and this storyboard that's told over and over again, what if that's told as him as himself as a male character? Dreaming or having this almost sexual relationship with this god figure and almost pining for Krishna as himself, as a man. What does that look like when it's choreographed explicitly into the form? So I think it's about, and then taking from those case studies, I choreographed some work that sits in between the binary. And so I think it's just about explicitly stating that when you do create a piece of work. And I think a lot more is happening in that space as contemporary influences make their way into Kathak and Indian classical forms. I will say it's very difficult because these forms are so codified, and a lot of what draws people to them is the long history of certain things, that certain rules and regulations that the maestros and people who've studied the forms for so long hold to such high regard. So I think it's difficult to infiltrate that space and break it up, but at the same time it's really exciting, and it's important to explore multiple gender identities through these forms that are so codified and historically haven't.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah, sure.
So I think it's a great question. And I think, one of the really powerful and beautiful things about all Indian classical dance is that it is gender fluid, that a female can play a male role and a female, we do it all the time, and a female can play a male role. And vice versa. So, I love that aspect in all of our forms and all the Indian classical dance forms. However, I do feel there are definite stereotypes that do exist, right? And I do think that we are trying to kind of challenge those stereotypes. So still, I can give an example in Kathak, where we have what we call gat nikases and gat bhavs. So gat is basically a gate. And, I have male students, and it's something that we're continuously challenging because, and I also know senior Kathak dancers, where they just don't feel comfortable doing these beautiful repertoire in Kathak. And I think it's such a shame because, it's such a lovely part of our repertoire. And I myself will be setting these guts, for my male students, because I do think that we are trying to find a place where there's more equality between our genders, and that's for women as well, right? So, yeah, thank you for that question.
Anna, thank you for creating that space and answering this question as well. And thank you, Shiv. I know that's a pretty loaded question. Could probably spend an entire panel on this topic, but I'm glad we got to just touch upon it a little bit. Our next question is from another audience member, Ms. Rajeshwari Satish, who I think some of us might know. She gives a special shout out to Shiv. She is Srinidhi's mom. I don't know what that means to you, but she asks, how can you as professionals who already uphold these values of professionalism communicate and help parents who often would rather conform to any inferior system that is in place to get their child ahead, rather than invest the time in finding or operating a professional space? How can we change that mentality so your efforts are immediately relevant to a large and growing body of listeners, parents, and teachers in the Indian art space? I think this is something we kind of touched upon during our parent panel, which CAREspaces hosted back in December. So Janani, I don't know if you wanted to start off with some thoughts, and maybe some of our panelists can also expand upon that.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say something really brief about it. And I always think about this as, we've made the default trust that we have in teachers be equal to respect. We really need to think about that. We need to rethink that really a lot, right? Like when we're going to a new teacher, we don't really know them. We're going to their house and we're, maybe putting ourselves forward there in a very vulnerable space. We don't know anything about them. And the parent just drops their kid off and like, okay, bye, And it's really important to be like, okay, what is the trust relationship that I'm putting there? That's the first thing. And why are we just accepting that default trust? Is that something that we should accept? Those are questions that parents need to ask. That's when they can actually get to the point where they understand that they can ask for accountability just as much. And that's what professionalizes the space, according to me, is where that there's that common dialogue, there's that constant dialogue, which even Rajeshwari Aunty said in the parent panel, which you need to have often and respectful communication between parent and student and teacher. So I think that really professionalizes the space. And I hope parents take that as a responsibility, because that's how they can be a professional too, right, in this space, even though they're not professional artists or teachers or organizers. That's how they can be professional, as in conduct, right? And they have to ask teachers questions. I definitely think that that's not disrespectful. We can't equate that to disrespect.
And if I may add something, yeah. Well, yeah. There's also an onus on the teachers to both, one, clarify the motivations on the part of the parents. I don't think they should accept students that are perhaps in it for their own personal gain. They should do it for the art form. And then also, it's on the teachers to communicate that the parents should hold them accountable. There should be a acknowledgement of the fact that you are in a position of power and that respect needs to be earned on your part as a teacher yourself. So, you maybe the things that are taken for granted as a teacher in the spaces nowadays, they're challenged by the next generation of teachers, and to make sure that there's a mutual respect between the teachers and the parents that's built first before there's any kind of default, shows of respect and things like that happen between the student and the teacher.
Mm-hmm. And it's really a performance, or it's really a personality shift that we need. more than like anything structural that we can implement. I think it's really like we have to change the way that we're conducting ourselves. That's how I see it. Yep. I hope that answered the question. It's kind of a loaded one as well.
I know, I feel like all of these questions can have their own panel discussion. We kind of did about this one specifically, but thank you both for that. And I think, Shiv, you touched upon this briefly as well, when you were mentioning like the default of the guru-sishya relationship. And, we've all come across this idea of like guru as God as a complex as well. So I think that definitely hits on some of the parts of this question. So our next question is from another audience member who asks, what should someone do to file a report from an informal space to an ICC maybe?
Dashmi, will you be able to take this one? Yeah, perfect.
So I'll just quickly answer that. Is that as per the POSH Act, there are two things for the redressal mechanism particularly. Any place where there are 10 or more than 10 people working, they're supposed to have the Internal Complaints Committee, which is the ICC. Now coming to the informal sector, because there are multiple places and they are not defined in the organized sector, for them at the district level, as per the Act, there is supposed to be, and all the districts have a local complaint committee, which is headed by the district magistrate. So anyone who wants to file a complaint, in case their own organization, institution doesn't have an ICC, or they are from an informal setting, or they are working in a place where less than 10 people are working, they can directly go to the local complaints committee.
Rashmi, can I ask one question? So what if there is an ICC committee, but it's not a conducive environment for you to go give a complaint?
Also the person can go to the local complaint committee, but when it will go to the local complaint committee, they definitely they're going to ask that, what your own organization or institution did it, what the ICC did. So they will come back, and in many cases, the organization might say that the person did not come to us at all. And then the person has the right that their complaint should be directly heard and redressed in the local complaint committee.
So if
it's specific to India, right?
It is specific to India. Yeah.
So if a person is reporting or putting a complaint forward, do they have to have an awareness of what spaces they operated in to articulate that complaint, or are there any requirements around how that complaint and report should be made?
Yeah, it's there's a huge protocol which is given in the POSH Act. Okay. I think anytime when you are you have the time, I can just quickly take you through a session. So it has the protocols that the ICC should be shared there. There should be a written complaint, and of course, if you look at the name of the Act, it says prevention, prohibition, and redressal. So the first part it says is organizations, workspaces, workplace should work towards prevention and awareness, because only when people are aware, they are going to use the redressal mechanism. And I think that becomes one of the barriers. When we deal with the cases, both the respondent and the complainant, many a time they will say, I did not because I didn't know that something like this existed. The respondent will say against who the complaint has been filed, oh, I didn't know that actually this behavior falls under sexual harassment, which of course, most of the time I don't trust, honestly. We all know. We always say that the respondent is aware of his or her behavior. The only thing which the respondent is not aware is the impact it is causing on the other person. So I think I think that these become some of the barriers. And see, also when we talk to the companies and the organizations or any workplace, we always say that it is not necessary that each and every complaint needs to become like a case of sexual harassment and the investigation will happen. And you pass those very threatening messages in the name of law, because that in itself becomes a deterrent for people to come forward and complain, because we know that there's a whole stigma around even going to a police station when it comes to domestic violence. So I think the whole idea is, like we were talking earlier, that how do we actually create this culture of respect and respect of speaking up, the whole culture of speaking up. And that too, I say that, okay, there are ways. If I am not happy with something what Shreya told me, while we were working together, let's say for this panel, then how do we create that space where I'm able to walk up to Shreya and say, instead of, that comes in a very, in that way of, naming, shaming people, because then that doesn't lead to any kind of, reflection and looking at your own behavior.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you for saying that. So I actually think, go ahead, Shreya.
I just wanted to also say, I think perhaps this is where I think the contracts are important, because Kritika from CAREspaces will definitely be able to talk about this, and we're going to do a whole session about this as well. But the contract is always going to lead one way or the other, right? But the point is the contract should give the student, or whatever, in this case, the person who doesn't have the power, some sort of power that they understand, and they have the law behind them. And again, it goes back to, again, becoming a professional space, again, becoming a formal space, again, accepting. Like, I know I've asked people to sign a contract and they've gotten very upset with me because they think I don't trust them. But this is not a question of trust. This is just a question of doing it and making it a norm, even though we're on the same page anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, Neha, I think we're going to have to stop the questions here. And I just would like Guhan, on behalf of Shreya and SNS and CAREspaces, to just recap the entire session, and then maybe Priyanka can give some closing remarks after that.
Absolutely. So I think there are a couple of very actionable takeaways here. And I think throughout the conversation, perhaps the word wasn't used explicitly, but the key word is nuance. In terms of spaces, it's not necessarily about the space that you're occupying, but about the conduct within those spaces. Like Samita was saying, regardless of where you are in charge of where your hands are, what words come out of your mouth, and nowadays what you type, tweet, post, send. You can be acting informally in a formal space, or vice versa. You can be acting formally in an informal space. But it never hurts to be on the safe side of those things. In terms of interactions as well, there's also nuance there. So Aditya was talking about how he had to challenge his sister and say, you're not the sister now, I'm not the brother now, we're coworkers. Extending this mentality to, for example, a guru-shishya relationship, and all people within the Indian art spaces, I challenge people to do that, because everybody that's involved within the space has a certain stake, and each one of those people has a right to be treated with respect and to be treated professionally. Now, we should challenge that mentality that we can treat somebody, perhaps in a lesser way because you already know them. You should always extend the same kinds of courtesies. Parul was talking about respecting each other and having a code of conduct in place. Things that are acceptable 20 years ago are not now, and we should acknowledge that. And also, Shiv was talking about how trust isn't there as a given, and we should probably earn that respect. And we also have to ask our questions, how do we progress our art forms forward so that, then there's a new norm of things that are acceptable, that are available to us, and actions that we should be taking and should not be taking. And this comes to finally our stakeholder approach. We have at CAREspaces come up with a minimal but comprehensive set of stakeholders that we feel are the cornerstones of what we consider Indian art spaces. So this includes performing artists, like people on our panel, Aditya, Shiv, Parul, connoisseurs, hopefully all of us here, teachers who should be respectful of pedagogy, but also trying to transform their art forms into this new era of arts. Students and parents who obviously have a right to know what their students, their children are getting into, and obviously having their own rights, protecting them, all these things. Performance and tour organizers who have an obligation to be, one, treated with, and also treat people with respect. Hosts that are hosting people within their own homes and giving up certain privileges to do so, and also artists who are coming into those homes and are treating them with respect as well. And finally, there are these supporting roles. Samita occupies a role in the media, but there are countless others that support the art form and make it profitable, number one, and two, safe for everybody else, and actually actionable. We have makeup artists, you might have photographers, videographers, audio and lighting individuals, and volunteers. There's a huge number of volunteers as well that make up most Indian art spaces. So this whole approach, we hope, clarifies the kinds of roles that people do take within the Indian art spaces, but also we hope that we have made clear what are the kinds of issues that arise within each one of these roles. The fact that multiple roles can be occupied by the same person, and that within each one of those roles and for each person that is occupying each one of those roles, respect should be had amongst and throughout all of the spaces.
Thanks for that, Guhan. And thank you for defining each of the stakeholders. We often, like you said, we often occupy multiple different roles within the space without even realizing it until we actually take a step back and think about all the different physical spaces we work in, all the different people we interact with. And the beginning of this panel went into all of that. The reason that we started out with defining all these vocabulary terms, getting Rashmi's perspective on the legal definitions of all these terms, is so that we can actually see where we stand in respect, with respect to other people within this space. We hope everyone can also see the benefits in defining these different stakeholders and defining the different spaces we work in. Because without that self-awareness, without that knowledge of where we are with respect to other people, it's extremely difficult to identify what conduct is okay and what's not okay. And the fact that everyone also has a stake within the space, whether you are more of a front-facing or public-facing a person within the space, or if you're more of a supporting role within the space, everyone has the right to feel safe within the space. Not just to feel safe, but to also be respected across, within each of the marginalized identities they may hold as well. So that's why this session really wanted to talk a lot about the kind of the basic terminology, the vocabulary. Yeah.
And if I can add one more thing, when we say I'm a professional too, I hope people are keeping in mind that the cornerstone of professional conduct is respect. And if you're not, no matter what practices you are implementing that make it seem professional, if it doesn't have a foundation of respect, it is not professional. It doesn't matter what the infrastructure of the space is. It doesn't matter how big or small the space is. It doesn't matter who you're interacting with and how well you know them. If there isn't a foundation of respect, then it is simply not professional. And as a student, parent, and connoisseur, if you notice that, if you see something, say something. And when you're saying those words and when you're hearing those words, I hope that these reminders come back to you. That was the point of this session. So I hope everyone felt like they got that out of this session. And with that, I'd like to wrap up today's session with just a few announcements from CAREspaces on upcoming things, and thank the panelists also for their time and audiences for their time. Thank you all again. Shifting gears a little bit, similar session to this, but a little bit different structure is happening in March, on March 28th, about protecting creative IP. And 2 days from now, we're actually launching our peer support service, which is kind of the other option if you do not want to go the legal route necessarily yet, and you just want to hear, you want someone to listen to your story, no matter to what extent the misconduct is that you've faced. Anyone in our space, even if you don't identify as a survivor, it's totally fine. You can be in bystander and you can come to us, and we have a set of 11 care leaders who are peer support providers who are trained explicitly to listen to stories within the Indian art space. And they've gotten a lot of cultural awareness and nuances within their training so that their service is very socially and culturally relatable to our space. So please feel free to check us out on Instagram to learn more about that. And there is a feedback form that probably was distributed to everyone on the YouTube Live. So if you could take a few minutes to give us that feedback. Like we said, this is the first conversation of this kind, so we would love to hear your thoughts on how successful it was in helping you understand these concepts. And I think it's also in the description box of the YouTube video, so please check that out. It'll just take just a few minutes, and we thank you for doing that. And if Shreya wants to wrap up with announcements from her side, that would be great. Thank you.
Yes, just I want to say that, it's always fun doing collaborations. It's interesting. It always makes you push your boundaries even further. So working with CAREspaces and I hope for them has been a good experience. And this is just the first of 5 that we're doing, and it's very exciting. I know the expectations are high, and we're also trying to work very hard to make sure we're able to sort of at least try and start creating the shift in thinking, behavior, etc., that are actually implementable at the end of these sort of sessions. as you know, SNS does a lot of work with helping artists become more professional, giving them the tools and the knowledge and the business acumen to be more successful, run more successful businesses. That could be a festival, a museum, dance school, and an independent artist as well. So one of the things that are, of course, the core to that is, of course, revenue and generating revenue. And paying taxes and saving the money that you earn is something that's very important being an artist. And we're doing a workshop on Friday, March 5th, at 6:30 p.m. India time, where we're going to be talking about pro tips to save on taxes and where do you invest this money that you're earning, because the financial year end, March 31st, is coming up in India. So it's really thinking of that tax planning, because 2020, 2021 has been a very, very difficult year for many. Some great, sometimes it's been fantastic in terms of revenue, sometimes it's not been. And I think it's important for artists to sort of make these smart decisions so they are able to sort of have the upper hand in terms of collaborations, in terms of running their own companies, and ultimately being in a better spot to make sure the art space is actually professional and safe. So with that, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for coming, and hopefully we'll see you on March 28th.